So as I understand it, we have an hour and 10 minutes, and I want to get as much time for discussion as possible, but I also encourage you to interrupt me. I was telling Kirsten that I have a tendency to speak in acronyms on occasion, so please just holler. Also, just by way of caveat, I tend to present to business audiences, and so I was just chatting with Bruce. It's going to be a great opportunity for me to get some of your thinking around the public policy, and particularly the international elements of this discussion. So what I was planning on speaking about today is what one might flippantly call the greening of K Street. And really what this means in short is how corporations can achieve or arrive at strategic and responsible positions on climate policy. Before I launch into some of this material, I think it's always a good idea for you to know who the speaker is and where they're coming from, and therefore what their agenda might be, therefore how good their data might be. And Stanford trained me well in that. So I'm just going to give you quick 4 slides on who BSR is, because it's not that obvious, and we don't communicate it that well. And then I'll launch into some of the more interesting material. So the mission is to create a more just and sustainable global economy by working with companies to establish more responsible business practices, innovation, and collaboration. The organization was founded in 1992, which, if you know the field of corporate social responsibility, was very, very early stages, and is the biggest, certainly US-based organization that works on these issues. It operates using 4 main strategies: working with and leveraging the membership. We'll talk about what that is composed of. Developing practical forward-looking research, or what I like to call horizon and trends-based research. Advisory services for member companies. And leveraging cross-sector collaboration to achieve systemic change. And I think what you'll find is, relative to some of our peers in this space, that's actually one of the unique assets of having a membership, which also comes with some drawbacks. It is a not-for-profit 501c3. So in certain areas, it looks more like a consulting firm, but it is a 501c3, a business association, but not a trade association, and does not do advocacy. There are about 250 member companies, most of which are US or European, although we increasingly have a number of Chinese companies and networks in Latin America and Africa. And then we now have about 15 people on the ground in China, spread across offices in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. And then the original headquarters, San Francisco, a new satellite office in New York, and 3 or 4 people, depending upon which month it is, in Europe. The board of directors right now, I think it's important to know who's driving the strategy. The board of directors right now is comprised of senior executives from our member companies. But there has been a decision that we will actually diversify that to include some more what we would call expert stakeholder voices, and that could include a representative from academia. This is an illustrative list of the members. You can sum it up as saying it's the big guys. They're all in there. It's the leaders, it's the laggards, it's everyone in between. The business model is something we're still sorting out after 15 years, but this is where I sit within R&D, which is a new function that I was hired to establish. You can see the mandate there. That obviously feeds into some of the consulting, which is a little bit more conventional in the way it takes shape, and either is at an individual client or at a collective working group level. We also have the biggest conference in the world on CSR, which for a 65-person organization becomes quite exhausting. This year it was in San Francisco, it's generally in New York, and we're talking about doing one in China next year. 1,200 people, this year 1,400 people. It's really a platform for networking and learning as much as anything. And then obviously the membership, really the central focus and hub of those activities. This is just a snapshot of what my team is planning on doing in 2008. Much of this work has already been launched. But so that you can see how we think about our work, climate change, obviously a key bucket, but we also want to look at the interrelationships with water, toxicity and health, including sustainable product design, and then land use and biodiversity. Each of these buckets has what I would call a signature initiative, and you'll see the partners in parentheses there. I'd be happy to talk with you more about what some of these catchphrases mean. I just wanted to give you a sense of what we cover. And then lastly, the publications, webinars, and workshops. This might be too small for you to read. This is what we've put out on each of these 4 buckets. And I brought display copies for you to see here, but I'd appreciate, I have a very small printing budget, so I'd appreciate if you could download them from the website rather than take these copies. So does anyone have any questions on that before I transition into the subject at hand? Okay. So this is no surprise to this group. Governments undertake a range of actions clearly related to responsible business, however you define that, from agenda setting, convening, rulemaking, which is the one that most people think of, rule enforcement, data collection and dissemination, and resource allocation. It's not entirely obvious sometimes some of these other functions. The REACH legislation that just went into effect in July in Europe is one example of really the onus of performance being put on industry, but the onus of data collection and dissemination being put on government. Investments in technologies and tax incentives to address climate issues is one great example. There were 7 billion subsidies put into biofuels in the US last year. That's relative to 3 billion investments in clean tech from venture capitalists. So it is not a small amount of money, and certainly federal contracts also play a role in driving market change. On the flip side, companies obviously also take a range of actions related to policy advocacy. This is a relatively new space for those in the corporate social responsibility, sustainability arena. Nobody's really wanted to deal with this yet. And here is an area where the lines get very fuzzy very quickly. So you have agenda setting, influence on enforcement, supporting influencing policy through support organizations. TechNet, for example, is the lobby group for the IT sector. John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, literally walked the halls of Congress over the summer advocating for a federal cap-and-trade system and an RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, at a federal level. This is direct, hand-in-hand advocacy. Maintaining and enhancing relationships with regulators. BT is an interesting example here. Ben Verweyen, who is their chairman, has, when Tony Blair was in office, became actually a real thought partner for Tony Blair. And by all accounts, Prime Minister Blair would call him up and ask his advice on certain climate-related things because BT had so much experience and therefore was able to explain what's feasible from a corporate perspective. That's a pretty nice position to have. You want to establish those relationships if you can. And then the sharing of data. Shell, interestingly, one of the best organizations in the world at scenario building. Not a surprise, but what's the surprise is that they actually divulge some of their admittedly genericized findings in order to influence policy. And then lastly, campaign donations. That's the obvious one that gets most of the attention. So if you wanted to map this out and you try and depict society, which is impossible, but let's give it a run. You've got NGOs, individuals and communities, academia, government and public agencies, and then corporations. The respective roles, clearly, traditionally have been to provide return on investment for companies, to create employment, drive innovation, pay taxes, and generate investment. Traditionally, government's role has been to establish the legal frameworks and norms, to enforce the laws, to allocate resources, and ensure a stable economy, which we have been doing a great job of in the past few weeks. So what's the interrelationships then? CSR, or I prefer sustainability for a variety of reasons, but here what is really being advocated is financial value creation by maximizing the positive impacts of business while minimizing the negative impacts. So you could see that as one interface point between companies and society, this larger bubble. Public policy, obviously, a second interface point, where company efforts to influence, respond to, and collaborate can have really quite key impacts on the common interest. So what I want to get to today is the fact that generally these two interfaces have been in utter isolation from one another. And what that's resulted in is, more times than not, a misalignment between those two agendas.